Hello and welcome to Tipsy Tolstoy, Russian literature for the inebriated.
I'm Matt Gerasimovich, a PhD student in Russian Lit. This week, I bought a bunch of hats.
Ooh, that's exciting. What kind of hats?
Well, glad you asked, Cameron. The one I'm wearing today is a challenge hat. And by that, I mean a hat that I challenged somebody else to get with me. I don't know if they have. It says, "Women want me, fish fear me. The scientist who created me is terrified of what he has done. His hubris, his desire to play God, has created a living being which he fears will rebel against him."
I love that.
The text is very small.
I would bet. That's a good hat, though. That's a great one.
I'm loving it.
All right. Well, I don't know who challenged to get it with you, but I hope that they have, in fact, gotten it.
The problem of being tall and wearing hats is that, I'm not like that tall, but I'd say I'm like taller than... I'm tall enough that when I'm wearing a hat, it's very difficult for people to see what funny things I have written on it.
You're taller than average, so
right.
You can just... yeah, about 50% of the population is going to be looking up at you.
Yeah, I find myself like stooping, like seeing if I can bait someone into reading my hat. Like, hey, it's pretty funny.
Yeah. I think people will do it. I whenever I wear my own hats with the words written on them, I have people often ask me just to like look down so they can read what's on my hat. So I believe in you.
Wow, I actually think I would hate that. It would take so long for someone to read this hat. Good thing I don't go out and...
You really planted the seeds of your own destruction.
My hubris, my desire to play God.
Well,
who are you?
Who am I? That's a great question. That's a really existential one. I'm not certain I'm fully prepared to answer it, but I can give you a superficial one, which is that my name, insofar as it has been given to me by my parents and by my lineage, is Cameron Lalana. And this week, this actually happened a little while ago, but I was texting Matt about it, and it made me laugh looking back on it. I was reading for Stalingrad in a bar. I just went after work, like at 6 p.m., expecting it to be pretty quiet there. It's just a place to kick back and get some reading done. And people just kept talking to me. That apparently was not a good decision. And first of all, they kept asking me, what is this book about? And I said, oh, and, knowing that not a lot of people are familiar with the Soviet side of World War II. And I said, oh, it's about World War II from the perspective of the Soviets. And people would nod along and say, oh, yeah, definitely. What's World War II? And then I was like, okay, it's when Nazi Germany invaded the rest of Europe, and they'd be like, oh, yeah, the Nazis. Yeah, they were like checking for papers and shit, right? And then I was like, yes, I mean, that's not like the main thing that they're known for, but yeah, that is something they did do. It's not really unique to the Nazis in a meaningful way, but
no.
And also at a certain point in the night, I was sitting next to this guy. We're both drinking whiskey. This is relevant to the story. And he's telling me about, learning to draw because he did about 10 years in prison. And the guy across the bar starts comparing his prison sentence, and the other guys join in. At a certain point, I began to realize I'm the only dude in here who hasn't done about a dime in prison.
Which is when you realize it was all set up.
Yeah. I think I was texting you at this point, and you said this is the most Cameron thing imaginable.
It really
or something
was.
along those lines. So the guy next, he was also drinking whiskey, and it was Jameson's, a pretty smooth whiskey as whiskeys go. But he's like really struggling with it, and he's like, he needed a Coke, and even then he was like really going back and forth. Like, man, this is rough. And maybe it's just because of my consummate alcoholism, but again, we were both drinking Jameson. It's very smooth, but I didn't want to give this man and I don't know what he did a decade in prison for, but I did not want to give him the impression I was belittling him, so I had to fake struggling with my whiskey along with him.
What a champ. Are you sponsored by Jameson?
Anyway.
How would you describe it again? Very what?
Very smooth. Really, the drink of choice you'd want if you are at a bar and you're realizing that maybe you aren't quite the crowd this bar usually is for. It calms you down and makes you feel like you are a part of it. By the end of the night, everyone was just like, I was there to like 9 or 10. People were like, every time someone came up to buy drinks at the bar, they'd be like, hey man, you want a drink too? They're all super friendly people. But yeah, definitely the introduction was a little intimidating.
Well,
anyway,
this is a podcast where me and my good pal Cameron get to unwind with our week. We get to unwind from our week with some Russian literature and a drink or two. This week, we are continuing the long trek that is making our way through Stalingrad. I think this is part 6, so that's pretty good.
It is indeed.
All right. I titled my episode correctly. It's pretty good. That's fun.
That's great. That's great.
Yeah.
Paradoxically, it feels like we do this series is a lot more and a lot less work than other series because there's so much more background and reading and extra stuff to be done, but also, we're just at this point, we're just like stumbling in, pulling up the script, and we're like, all right, let's go.
Yeah, it's fun.
Yeah, it is fun. Well, speaking of stumbling in, Matt, I got to ask you before we get into the reading, what are you drinking today?
Well, speaking of being sponsored, I am sponsored this week by water. That's right. This episode is brought to you by me, reminding you to drink water like me. You might be thinking, Matt, you sound disgusting. What are the mouth noises that I'm hearing through your microphone? That is the lingering effects of COVID that I got this week, so that was fun. Yeah, my life has been a lot of light and shadow recently as I've been sleeping in this dream state, reading Stalingrad, sleeping more.
Sure.
That's about it. So I'm drinking water this evening.
That's entirely fair.
What about you?
I serendipitously am also drinking water because I'm I'm moving this week, so I'm going to be moving more or less in the work week. So I've got to taking this weekend time to get as much packed up as I can so I can get to my new apartment. So I need to keep working after this. So it looks like today is a sober Solzhenitsyn for both of us.
That's just wonderful.
Okay. Now we're going to be continuing on with our episode 6 of this series, which is going to be in part 2, chapters 22 through chapter 40. This is a rough one. That's all I have to say about what's going to happen here.
Yeah, it wasn't the best. I was reading before bed last night, and my girlfriend was like, "Oh, how's it going?" Because that's how everyone sounds to me with my stuffed up COVID ears. And I was like, "Well, it wasn't going great, and then it got a lot worse." That I'm pretty sure a bunch of kids died. So,
yeah,
orphans. If that makes it better, it doesn't. It doesn't.
No, I think it might actually make it. I guess it's not better or worse. You can't really. I'm not going to get into the mathematics of which children are at saddest when they die, but okay. So we join in chapter 22, an interesting perspective which we have not seen since the beginning of the book. We rejoin the Nazi military perspective of events, specifically with a German general, Weller. Weller's getting ready for the invasion of Stalingrad. He's hearing that it's been dictated that Stalingrad must fall, and he's kind of thinking upon the despair he imagines the Russian people, the Soviet people as a whole must be feeling. And the narrator writes, had the general been a psychologist and a philosopher, he might have suspected that what for him was a source of joy and excitement inevitably gave rise to very different, dangerously powerful feelings in the heart of the Russians. But he was not a philosopher, he was a general. I'm bringing that up because this first half of what we're going to be reading is very heavily, I will say, philosophical. It is the narrator telling you about what German high command was like at this point in the war and philosophizing about what that meant in a more ideological sense. So from Weller, we continue on to General Paulus, who's the commander of the German 6th Army, who's thinking about the soon-to-be capture of Stalingrad, who is about to be joined by General Richthofen. Richthofen is the commander for the Air Force, German Air Force. And just as a side note here, I want to bring in this line. It seemed that Richthofen had much in common with the ever-fortunate Rommel, that lucky dog whose popularity was inversely proportional to his knowledge, his capacity for thought, and his understanding of military culture.
Get dunked, you dummy.
That was just good to read. I'm glad that if you've ever hung around online spaces that study World War II, there's a weird amount of worship for General Rommel from people who are like, no, I don't like the Nazis. I just admire their military capabilities. And there's a weird amount of love for Rommel. And so it's funny to see that this has been a feature since the actual war.
I actually really like the way that this section that we're reading starts. I thought it was an interesting perspective. I understand why I would assume the Nazi parts would have been banned or not allowed or redacted or censored. Just because, you probably don't want to read anything from the invading perspective, even if it is, making fun of them.
Yeah, which this is all about the commanders thinking ill of each other, and it's a power game between them for status. Even when Richthofen and Paulus are discussing the invasion of Stalingrad, keep in mind that this is the ground and the air discussing. It's really an unsaid fight between the two, between Richthofen, who thinks that the ground should be subordinate to air, and Paulus, who thinks that the air should be subordinate to ground.
Yeah, I mean, I think to me it's pretty clear what he's saying. and why it would not at all be easy to mistake any sort of sympathy or anything for the Nazis, obviously. But maybe it would be subtle to some people. I don't know. It's because it's really about the essence of each state, basically. Individualism or collectivism, if you're going to just break it down. Whether you have any sort of capacity to work together or whether you're just trying to cut each other down at like any possible time.
Which is a huge feature of this section we're going to go into reading as we go from the front back to Berlin. So after being introduced to a Colonel Forster, who is an old friend and a former superior officer of General Weller, they discuss Stalingrad as if it's already theirs, having heard Hitler's command that Stalingrad must fall. Briefly, we hear that the two of them back in the early days of the party, both of them had actually spoken very ill, almost called the leadership bloodthirsty, stupid, really. And of course now another man had, it's noted, forgotten either of this, but the unwritten code of the Reich didn't allow even such close friends to recall those conversations. So as we go back to Berlin, we learn about the press and their perspective on war. Now that after the grim days of late 1941 and the crushing defeat in the Winter Campaign, so now in the summer of 1942 with the fall of Kerch, with Sevastopol, with Rostov-on-Don, with the German Wehrmacht and the Air Force just steamrolling back across the Soviet Union, now the tone of the press is, well, has gone from grim restraint, it is said, to joyful fantasies. And it kind of papers over these former losses, and it's written, these successes of those recent battles displace the memory of terrible losses, of crosses on soldiers' graves, of the alarming urgency of the last winter relief campaign, and of how train after train, day and night, had brought back wounded and frostbitten soldiers from the Eastern Front. These successes silenced those who saw the whole Eastern Campaign as an act of madness, those who worried about the strength of the Red Army and were still troubled by the Führer's failure to keep his promise to capture Moscow and Leningrad by mid-November 1941, and bring the war to a swift, victorious conclusion. Life in Berlin was now all bustle and noise. And this kind of is a big feature of this section, talking about how the propaganda, the notion of life as something that the Nazi Party creates, overruling what life is actually like, what people are actually going through. That's a huge feature of what we're going to be talking about. So from going from this broad perspective on the press, we join the new Reich Chancellery. We learn about the lives of the people who work there, and then join a man who is described in not the most generous terms, features, but in a pretty funny way, after about half a page of description, calling this man weirdly proportioned with bags under his eyes, with the torso of a skinny man, but the legs of a fat man. It's revealed that this is in fact Hitler. And I think it's notable for an author who is so insistent on comparing and talking about the people. Even in joining the New Reich Chancellery, we're just talking about the officers, their common lives, the janitors, the normal people who are working there. But Hitler does not get that. In fact, I will say the nicest thing that is said here is, while he was asleep, lying in his long nightshirt under a blanket, mumbling, snoring, chewing his lip, grinding his large teeth, turning from side to side, drawing his knees up to his chest, while he was asleep, this man in his 50s had much in common with any other middle-aged man with a shattered nervous system, an impaired metabolism, and heart palpitations. It was indeed during these hours that Hitler was closest to being a human.
I feel like that is, you'd think it's the nicest thing he says, but I feel like if you are that type of personality, the idea that you could have that much in common with just anyone else is so horrifying to think of.
Yeah.
Which I feel like it's a good psychological burn.
Yeah, yes it is.
Got him.
And got him.
Ended.
So Hitler is joined by Himmler, who gives a report on Stalingrad. We learn more about the psychology of Himmler and kind of what it takes to serve Hitler as he does. A lack of freedom of thought, and a need to avoid any notion of obsequiousness, anything that could get him ejected from his position, as one of the vaunted few who Hitler still listens to, although of course Hitler doesn't really listen to him. And the entirety of the section after learning about Himmler's psychology is Hitler raging against Himmler, raging against his other allies, raging against his generals, raging against his troops for failing to understand his vision and why everyone's failing him. And they don't understand why he's doing what he does. And they are the enemies as much as, the others, the Slavs, the Jews, the Roma, the Poles, everyone really, that they see as their race enemies. So Colonel Forster, the friend of General Weller, has arrived back in Berlin, and he's called to give the Fuhrer a briefing from the Wehrmacht's perspective on the invasion of Stalingrad. It takes him a while to actually see the Fuhrer. He's waiting for almost an entire day. But when he's finally called in, he realizes that actually Richthofen has screwed over Paulus, because when Richthofen and Paulus are talking, Paulus says, I need about 4 days or 5 days to prepare me. And Richthofen says, well, I need a week to get the Air Force ready. You know, we're more complex than the ground troops. I'll tell Hitler that. Now, in the presence of Hitler, we find out that Richthofen has in fact said, I'm going to be ready immediately. So Paulus asking for 5 days to prepare looks very bad. Reflecting this continual struggle for power among them, at the actual necessities of military operations falling under the feet of, personal self-aggrandizement or advancement. So as Forster is explaining the plan to invade Stalingrad to Hitler, Hitler really is not paying very close attention, and Forster kind of has this realization. On the previous day, Forster had imagined that the order to take Stalingrad on 25th August was born from precise calculation and a careful analysis of the military situation. He had imagined the Fuhrer taking into account the Panzer's fuel reserves, the mobility of the support columns, and the quantitative and qualitative superiority enjoyed by the German Air Force. He had imagined that the Fuhrer had a precise grasp of the dynamic force encapsulated in each infantry division, of the speed with which ammunition and reserves could be brought up to the front, of the efficiency of the liaison and signals sections. He had imagined the Fuhrer as having at his command an almost infinite amount of information. He had thought that when the Fuhrer had said, Stalingrad muss fallen, he was taking into account the effect of meteorological conditions on the state of the roads in the Don Steppe, the sinking of British convoys attempting the voyage to Murmansk, the fall of Singapore, and Rommel's impending attack on Alexandria. Now, though, Forster realized that the words Stalingrad muss fallen had nothing to do with the reality of the war. They were simply an expression of Hitler's wish.
That's a great line.
Yeah, and really, it's kind of the encapsulation, I think, of so much of what the section is talking about, of the actual realities, the day-to-day realities, which Grossman himself, as a writer, is so concerned with, the people, in which he rages against, even Soviet leaders for failing to talk to their soldiers or talk to the civilians. He takes it to a new height and kind of says, well, this is the inherent reason of like the failure of fascism, or of this particular form of Nazi fascism, is that it's not just like a failing to talk to people, but simply like an entire detachment from the material reality of the world and to a world that only exists in some kind of mystical, individual realm.
Well, I think it's also a critique of people who look back through history and think of, I feel like Hitler and then also Napoleon gets placed on that same pedestal of like, well, not a good person, but military genius. When it was just like, well, not really, just wanted to do that and did. In some situations, it wasn't like some grand calculation.
Right. There's we'll talk more about this later. Maybe we'll read it, but there's a section in which he kind of says, why do we praise an arsonist if instead of burning a, town barn, he instead burned several cities? We should like disregard such people from history, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot of good stuff in this part.
I thought this was a really, chapter 30, I think, is maybe one of my favorite things I've read this entire book, and that's Tough Competition.
Yeah.
Just because of, I think, a really accurate psychological assessment of maybe like not Hitler necessarily. It is a psychological assessment of Hitler, but of course, I don't put much actual stock in like armchair psychology. However, as like trying to understand the psychology of fascism embodied through a theoretical character of Hitler, I think it's quite good.
I think that from a narrative perspective, like, I think part of the reason the book had to be so long is you really have to earn some of these chapters. I feel like it does take a while for Grossman to really kind of step out of the narrator and give you his own thoughts. I mean, he obviously sprinkles it throughout, but I felt like this section in particular, kind of with the lead up to the battle, was particularly dense with Grossman thoughts. And it was good. I just think it wouldn't have been good if he started the book with it.
Right. Yeah.
Like,
so
who is this guy?
This had to happen.
Yeah.
550 pages in.
Right. Like, I'm invested. I want to know what he thinks.
Yeah, that's fair. But before we get to what he thinks, we join Lieutenant Peter Bach. Now, Peter Bach is a friend of Maria Forster's, who is the daughter of this Colonel Forster we've been following. Lieutenant Bach is temporarily back in Berlin on leave, and he finds a people that he doesn't really like. And this is kind of one of the ironies of, not really irony, but of like these fascist elements, is that they're fighting for this idea of Germanness, but they don't really like Germans all that much. He like is disgusted by the old people he sees, or he kind of refers to them as mothballs almost, and he can't stand being back in Berlin. He wants to go back to the war front. And even, his old friend Lunz, they don't get along like they used to, and he kind of looks down on Lunz, except for the point when Lunz voices something that he agrees with but can't really say because he's an officer a lieutenant in the Wehrmacht. But Lunz, who is an intellectual, says to him when they're drinking one night, "I work at a factory. Up above the machines are huge banners with slogan, 'Du bist nicht, dein Volk ist alles,' which kind of translates to 'You are nothing, the Volk is everything.' Sometimes I think about this. Why am I nothing? Am I not Volk? And you too? Are you not Volk? Our era loves grand statements. People are hypnotized by their apparent profundity. What nonsense they are." And I think this kind of incidentally sets up, like, even though I think the idea of people coming together, you could very broadly, in a vulgar sense, compare them between Nazism and fascism. And I think Grossman's trying to draw a line here that in this Nazi version of this togetherness of unity, the Volk is everything, but the Volk also isn't real. The Volk is an idea, and the individual is nothing, whereas Grossman puts up not directly, but like the Soviets as kind of the people, of course, in this case, the Volk in the Soviet context are the worker. There's an idea that the worker is everything. Now, the historical reality of that's a little bit different. However, that's the difference in ideology that Grossman's trying to set up here.
It is interesting. I would not agree with him.
With Grossman in this particular formulation.
This idea like, our generation loves these kind of bold statements. I actually think that it is a really insidious kernel of basically all ideology. And what he's discussing, I think, kind of around this time and at this point, is not specific to the Nazis. I really do believe that this stems from advertising and from thinkers who were trying to work on how to mobilize populations en masse. And so it's not really necessarily specifically tied to the Nazis. They definitely used it, but so did a lot of other people, the Soviets included.
Yeah.
And we still do.
Which is a good point.
But that's a different podcast topic.
That's maybe a different podcast too.
Yeah. Part of my master's thesis, so I got thoughts on it.
We'll come back to that one day in an episode.
I know.
An
I
episode
do
of your thesis.
a Russian literature master's, and I'm like, I'm going to write about advertising. Like a moron.
And get a load of this guy.
Get a load of this guy.
So we continue on in chapter 30, and the chapter starts off by saying basically Hitler's unimportant. It says, like, it doesn't matter who Hitler is, because the rise of German fascism needed a Hitler, and then Hitler happened to be that person, kind of saying that the psychology of Hitler is immaterial. It's rather his psychology matched that which the fascist rise in power needed in Germany at the time. But he does say, the narrator says, well, understanding his character, though, will better help us understand the nature of fascism, because his character essentially reflects fascism, and then goes on to just fucking lay down the belt.
I wrote in the margins here, I said, wow, drag him.
He goes on to elaborate that Hitler is essentially a lifelong failure, failing to do well in school, failing to get into even modest art schools, failing to carry out a revolution, failure in relationships. And he says, before and after he came to power, Hitler was essentially the same person, a petty bourgeois, a Philistine, and a failure. And he continues to talk about this idea of fascism as merely as the ideology of failures, those who cannot understand labor as being superior. And I'm going to read a couple of the lines. Feel free to, if you got any other stuff you want to talk about, Matt, feel free to break in. But he goes to talk about the relationship between misreadings of Nietzsche and the idea of the Superman built into this Nazi ideology. And he writes, we see more clearly than ever that the Superman is born out of the despair of the weak, not from the triumph of the strong. The ideas of individual liberty, internationalism, the social equality of all workers, these are the ideas of people confident in the power of their own minds and the creative force of their own labor. The only form of violence countenanced by these ideas is the violence inflicted by Prometheus on his chains. So this is a more direct one, differentiation between, the ideologies of Nazism and the ideology of the Soviet Union, stated more directly. he goes on to say that you're talking about Hitler's ideologies as Hitler saw the man sowing a vast wheat field as inferior to the thug who smashes him over the back of the head with a crowbar, reflecting the fact that violence was seen as the fact of rightness, the fact of the ability to be the chosen people was reflective of the fact that violence, that was the only measure, nothing else. Efficiency, everything falls to the wayside of the ability to do violence to others. Say wheat field? So Tolstoy emerges on the scene and just absolutely stunners Hitler.
He destroys him with his scythe.
So the thug who smashes him over the back of the head with a crowbar, this is the philosophy of a loser who has fallen into despair, who is unable to achieve anything through labor but is endowed with a strong mind, ferocious energy, and a burning ambition. He goes to talk more on about Germany, the people as a whole. He deceived many who might have stood against him. They mistook his lies for truth, and his hysteria for sincerity. They saw his religion of hatred as love of Germany, his powerful animal logic as a token of genius, and his criminal dictatorship as a promise of freedom.
That was such a good line.
This whole chapter is full of good lines. I like this one a lot. This kind of gets the idea of what you're talking about, of also Napoleon's too. Mm-hmm. Physicists usually feel free to ignore the infinitesimally small value that expresses the Earth's gravitational attraction to a stone. They do not deny the theoretical reality of this attraction, but it is only the stone's gravitational attraction to the Earth that they need to take into practical account. Hitler, at the height of his success, wanted to do the opposite. He wanted to ignore the gravitational attraction of a stone or a grain of sand to the Earth. A mere grain of sand himself, he wanted to restructure the world according to the laws of his own will and intuition. So actually, I want to read the line that you were referencing earlier, talking about this and criticizing the idea of great men of history as conquerors. Can we call someone a great man if he has not brought into the people's lives a single atom of good, a single atom of freedom and intelligence? Can we call someone a great man if he has left behind him only ashes, ruins, and congealed blood, only poverty and the stench of racism, only the graves of the countless children and old people he has killed? Can we call someone a great man because his unusual intelligence, able to detect and co-opt every dark and reactionary force, proved as virulent and destructive as the bacteria of bubonic plague?
I've never read a stronger condemnation of anyone or anything in my life than this chapter.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a little bit more. I'll give you a thought, but we'll come back to it after I finish this last paragraph. Sure. The 20th century is critical and dangerous time for all humanity. It is time for intelligent people to renounce, once and for all, the thoughtless and sentimental habit of admiring a criminal if the scope of his criminality is vast enough, of admiring an arsonist if he sets fire not just to a village, but to capital cities, of tolerating a demagogue if he deceives not just an uneducated lad from a village, but entire nations, of pardoning a murderer because he has killed not one individual, but millions. Such criminals must be destroyed like rabid wolves. We must remember them only with disgust and burning hatred. We must expose their darkness to the light of day. And if the forces of darkness engender new Hitlers, playing on people's basest and most backwards instinct in order to further new criminal designs against humanity, let no one see in them any trait of grandeur or heroism. History's only true heroes, the only true leaders of mankind, are those who help to establish freedoms, who see freedom as the greatest strength of an individual, a nation, or a state, who fight for the equality in all respects of every individual, people, and nation.
The end of the book. You said,
the end. An opinion I hold is that there has never been a good... that there's only ever been one good eulogy written for a politician, and that was Hunter S. Thompson's for Richard Nixon. But I take that back because this, in a way, it's not intended to be, but it is a eulogy of sorts for Hitler, and I think this might be the only other good eulogy written for a politician.
I just think of, what a sense of historical perspective you must have when you're writing your book to even just consider your own place in your own century. Right. Isn't that crazy? I mean, I guess they're pretty far into it, but I've never even for myself, maybe that's because I don't do anything important, but I'm never this will be surely a great moment of this century.
Right.
Anyways, that's not really that important. I just wanted to, it really took me out of the book when I read that. I feel like I don't see a lot of writers pondering their place in their own century.
No.
It's the biggest, almost Tolstoyan ego move I could think of. This is great.
All right, part 4, we undermine the idea of Grossman as the Soviet Tolstoy, and now we're bringing it back.
No, I think Tolstoy is more like a pre-revolutionary Grossman.
Broke, Grossman is a Soviet Tolstoy. Woke, Grossman is not a Soviet Tolstoy. Bespoke, Tolstoy is a pre-war Grossman.
That's it. Put that on a shirt.
Yeah, it's also, I mean, again, it's a further, elaboration on Grossman's talking about the ideology of trying to give it a diagnosis of sorts. And I think, today saying that, okay, this like fascism is an ideology of losers it's not like I've heard that 10 billion times. However, I think Grossman takes an interesting perspective on things by specifically, because it's easy to say that, but he's like, no, let me outline to you how failure becomes success, and how then also ties it not just to like specifically like, oh, this is a unique form of evil, but in fact, this is something that pops up again and again. These people who become arsonists, not of a village, but of of capital cities, of demagogues who are not just, selling snake oil, but, selling racism across the continent. It's got I think a much more specific, I guess I'll say, diagnosis and understanding of how the human tendency kind of feeds into that. And, not sectioning this off as some unique evil, but saying, well, here are the features which make it arise in, in any given country.
So I know we don't talk about current politics usually on the podcast, but when you were reading this section, like for like some parts of it, weren't you like, a little too close to home? A little bit. Didn't like it.
I had those same thoughts. I was like, that's not usually what we talk about, but it's not irrelevant now.
Particularly resonant passages.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But I also think that, we talk about Grossman and Tolstoy, but also I think actually this line that you read, we can now see more clearly than ever that the Superman is born of the despair of the weak, not from the triumph of the strong, made me think about Dostoevsky a lot, particularly Raskolnikov. Dostoevsky, Nietzsche, there's just a lot of tie-ins that you can kind of draw out, I think.
Right. Yeah.
I'm not going to draw them all out. I think that's a separate work. That's just a question I'm posing, or just maybe on a deeper level. He's obviously engaging in quite a long line of intellectual thinking. Yeah. It's not just a mimicry of Tolstoy's style or anything like that. He really is trying to engage on a much deeper level.
Yeah, definitely trying to get into, I think you can see that in the way that we've talked about this previously, that we've talked about the tensions of ideology in the book, and part of that coming from knowing who he's writing for, knowing that they're going to be censors, maybe figuring out, maybe being himself uneven on some of these things. We were kind of doubling back. This was written over a long period of time. Of course, Grossman experienced great tragedy at the hands of the Nazis and also suppression at the form of his own government. So you see back and forth, and I think that's only natural as he's kind of conversing with himself. But there are also moments where it comes together in almost a crescendo, I would say, where it all seems to have a great sense of clarity. And, here, where he's condemning Hitler, but also those like Hitler and those so-called great men of history who he, refers to as, arsonists and murderers, and says, it's now time for us to move beyond admiring such people as a whole. And it really doesn't mince words either about it. No. He's not saying we should let them retire peacefully on an island somewhere nice. No, he says they need to be destroyed. Like rabid wolves. Yeah, Uh-huh. Yeah. Anyway, so that's the German section of this part. So that's where Grossman ended the book. That's where Grossman single-handedly ended the war. Yep. Oh, sorry, my last thing. You made me think of it. On the physicist. Okay. Not only, I wonder if this is where she got this line of her book in Unwomanly Face of War. Alexeyevich says that she's not interested in these I'm paraphrasing, these large-scale events, but she's more interested in the grains of sand of history. And when he's talking about, you read the line when Grossman says a mere grain of sand himself wanted to restructure the world. Just this approach to looking at the world as if it's made up of grains of sand, not as if it is this accumulation of sand, right? Is a particularly interesting way. A real way that writers have, I find, right, of looking at things and dissecting them.
Not necessarily specific to Grossman or Tolstoy or Alexeyevich, but the fact that she had that specific quote that stuck with me made me wonder how influenced she was by Grossman.
Yeah.
My guess?
Good question.
A bit.
Maybe somewhat.
My guess? She's read them.
Yeah, I think that, well, it's especially poignant, I would say, in Grossman, because he's writing this, in the late war years to the early post-war years. And so looking at the world as like grains of sand, it's also applied to the German nation at this time. It's not just like, as you might understandably come to as someone has lost family to the Nazis, who were specifically targeted because they were Jewish. You might imagine him feeling this great sense of grievance against, the army, the nation that it is a whole. But even in these moments when he's coming in to just absolutely, backhand Hitler to the moon, he's also talking about the individual fears and, the secret hidden world of Berlin, of the second half of Berlin at night, which is worried about wounded soldiers and the lack of rations and, what are we going to do going forward? And then kind of says, well, will this daytime world of, of Hitler, where, reality is merely an extension of his fist, in the nighttime world of people and their concerns, what would happen to that after the war? Would those become one, or would they continue on as always? So this perspective of this multitude of perspectives is even carried through to the literal heart of the Nazi Empire at this time.
Yeah, I found that interesting too, that he, even though it would be easy to do and even understandable, but he just refuses to condemn Germany as a whole and all Germans. He really is insistent on actually, and I think this is what gives it that sort of holistic and interesting and nuanced approach, is looking at how like well-intending people can get swept up into it. And how, not only that, how there is actual, still underground dissent, how that can kind of manifest and whatnot, particularly with the intellectuals, as he does.
Right. And also, too, him kind of pointing out some of the funny, not funny exactly, but not haha funny, but ironic features of history of so, for example, there's a section, I forget which part of this is, if it's in chapter 30 or chapter 29, where Grossman kind of is talking about fascism as a loser ideology, of that ideology of losers, and it says it has no connection to reality. They had this idea of a pure German race, but with the influx of slaves and forced labor from all over Europe, in fact, this was the time of a great, much more race mixing than previously was probably true, or even possible. And so he comes in and is pointing out those features like that, the contradictions of ideology in life, which is perhaps, Grossman in real life was, even when in Germany, was always talking to people. So whenever I see a vignette or a life story, I always wonder, is this something that was created, something that was Grossman wants to portray for the feeling, or is this Grossman actually portraying something that actually he saw or somebody actually talked to? Because so much of this book is based on real events he either saw or heard about.
Yeah, I think that begs the question, right? What is the limit of an idea? How powerful can an idea be? And I think this is where Grossman is wrong, personally, in that he seems to think, fascism, the idea of it is it's fundamentally not able to exist in reality. It's not quite, it's incongruous with reality, I guess. And for me, I actually think that ideas can structure reality and can reshape reality. I just think fascism is not a good example of that kind of idea.
Well, that's kind of the same argument that Victor Shroom and his teacher has, where his teacher says, well, no, it's just what you would almost think would be Grossman's perspective is, well, the German people can't be changed by ideology. They'll come out on it, who they were before. And Victor says to him, no, I mean, if that's true, then that would also imply that our own ideologies can't change us. And in fact, this is, we should not be doing this, which provides, almost a sense of tension here between, the statements, which I don't think is a contradiction, but.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I have to believe that since I study Gramsci. So if I didn't, then I would have to get my Gramsci card revoked. Yeah.
I will say this is really interesting. Going back to, I know I was going to continue on, but
no,
chapter 3 made me think is, it's interesting because there's this, I don't know if you ever read Aime Cesaire.
No, but I wasn't going to say anything. I was going to leave it ambiguous.
Okay.
People are like, wow, Matt's so well read, like that.
Yeah.
As they do.
That's fair.
As the fans
That's
clamor
fair.
about.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and apologize already for my name of my pronunciation of Aime Cesaire. I refuse to learn French. I will not.
Oh, it's
I will not
French?
learn French.
Okay, then I don't feel bad.
Well, so he's not French. He's Martinician, and he's kind of the founder of. He's done a lot. You should look him up. He's very interesting. But he wrote an article on like Hitlerism in World War II, and I don't have the name of it right now, but I'm going to find it. And you know, Aime Cesaire himself, who was black, and he kind of just like lambasts people who, not like people like Grossman, but people who think of this violence done upon Europe as some kind of strange feature of history, and says like, how could this be anything else rather than this is the same or similar violence that European colonialist powers have been inflicting on South America, on Africa, on China and Asia as a whole, and minus Japan, depending on the era. But it's the exact same sort of crimes they've been inflicting for years upon the rest of the world. So how can we be surprised when this very same violence happens in Europe? It's the natural extension that eventually, if it's okay to, in Congo for the Belgian colonialist powers to murder and mutilate upwards of 2 million people, why can we not also conclude that one day someone will look at someone in Europe itself and say, you are also someone who is outside the right sort of race or group or whatever, and we can also kill or mutilate 2 million of you. That's something you don't really see in a lot of, I would say, like more Western views. I mean, not that Aime Cesaire wasn't Western himself, but like on mainstream views of the war. And I think Grossman is the person that comes closest to kind of addressing that idea, where he's looking at Hitler not as some sort of weird. And you see this is a perspective you see really often, as if like violence and Nazism is some sort of like weird, like where did that come from angle, or rather is addressing it as a tendency that humans can have, and one that they have the power to buy into or not to buy into. Mm-hmm. I don't really know where we're going with that, but it was just, I was thinking about it while we were reading that chapter.
For the record, I have read him. There's a thing when you see names that you've never heard out loud.
Yeah.
And then
I've also never actually heard it out loud.
No, you did great. Probably, I don't know.
Perfect. Beautiful.
Yeah, there was some, I don't remember if it was this part or where, I don't even remember who it was in this book, because why would I? But just there's been like some parts where people are bringing back like artifacts or things from different places that the Nazis have taken over that are not Russia or the Soviet Union, or that are like, I don't know, wherever. And they're like, wow, look at how cool and exotic this thing is.
Right. Oh yeah, it was Colonel Forster. Yeah, it was. It's like Colonel Forster's like bringing back little trinkets from Ukrainian homes or shoes of like an Azerbaijani child or something. And you're like, it wasn't like I just happened to be in, I don't think it was Azerbaijan, but like some similar either like kind of, a country in that rough area of like, wasn't just like, I was visiting in market and I happened to buy those because I thought they were neat. That's not how it's not a good situation shoes.
Onto which he's stumbling upon children's shoes, I would wager a guess.
You're right.
Anyways.
Which is, going back to our conversation last time about Grossman writing, in some ways reflecting like this very Russia-centric view of the war, but also Grossman in less direct ways acknowledges in a lot of the non-Russian people involved in that side of the war too. It's a small thing, but it's very present, right? Like bringing back such quote unquote trophies from other smaller Soviet republics, or the orphan children we're getting too soon being from all over the place, or being Volga Germans, or Kazakh or Ukrainian, or similar.
Yeah, he does it sometimes, and then other times he'll be talking about soldiers at Stalingrad, and he'll be like, and they let out a really good Russian laugh, even though like most of them probably weren't ethnic Russians.
Yeah,
but I think I'd like to imagine he's doing it in like a look at our sense of unity kind of way. But it still comes across in a way that I'm like, I just wish you would have stopped while you were ahead.
Yeah. Yeah. So, speaking of things we wish would stop, the bombing of Stalingrad commences. So we have, before we even get to the bombing of General Richthofen's planes laying waste to Stalingrad, we join an average morning in Stalingrad, which is noted that it's much like any other day in Stalingrad. In the hours up to when the war came to Stalingrad, people were chatting, we overhear two women knitting, people are getting ready for their day, cooks are just trying to find some embers in last night's fire so they can light a cigarette. People are going about their lives and being dicks, being nice, etc., etc. And Grossman writes of this. and we are used to calling simple, ordinary folk. And those we are used to calling simple, ordinary folk had no idea that in a few hours, many of them would be performing deeds that future generations would refer to as immortal, and that they would do this as naturally and straightforwardly as they had until then gone about their everyday work. It is not only heroes who love freedom, take joy in labor, know maternal feelings, and feel loyalty to their country. And here, perhaps, lies humanity's greatest hope. Great deeds can be accomplished by simple, ordinary people. A while back, we had this conversation about the features of the story, which are ordinary-ordinary and ordinary-heroic. And here we find, Grossman emphasizing this notion of ordinary-heroic features of people, in which that these people who are, whatever their personal character is, they can. I think that's one of the things I like about Grossman is that he doesn't shy away from characters being, not always great people or being, not like good or bad, but just that they have individual failings, but that doesn't condemn an individual. It doesn't mean that they won't be there for you in the moment that it matters.
No, it's actually, to me, it's a much more realistic kind of socialist realist hero.
Right.
It's like you can be the hero when it really counts. You don't have to be the hero all the time in every single situation, because obviously that is not possible.
Yeah. In fact, I would say that actually Grossman kind of takes a swing at this kind of notion. When these two women are talking, he writes of one of them, who is very judgmental. Years later, when these world-shaking events have receded far into the past, people like her look back at those days and see only somber burial mounds bearing witness to superhuman achievements. They then come to think that everyone alive then was to her a spiritual giant. This noble but naive view of the past is no less misguided. That, looking back, like no one is a superhuman, even in this context, and we've got obviously the Nazi context where he's saying that this is like this is like the ideology of people who need a Superman. In the same way, kind of says, well, no, Supermen don't exist in our own context either. And if you think they are, then you misunderstand who people were. They're just ordinary people. And I think a lot about, from his article, Ukraine Without Jews, and he's talking about the Jewish people and Jewish life, and he says, they lived and died and sinned and did good deeds alongside Ukrainian people. And it's always stuck me that he put sinning before the good deeds, and good deeds almost as an afterthought. That was fronted such that life had this complexity, that they didn't have to be ups and downs, and people had individual failings, and that's not reflective on their place in history or how we should look at them, and we should allow them to be good people and sinners, which are not contradictory frames of reference at all, I think, in Grossman's writing.
Yeah. No, I don't think so either.
So we go from this sense of unity, of heroism, and we join the planes demolishing the city, and it is a long passage of destruction, although Grossman points out at this end of the destruction of 1 million buildings cannot be as terrible as the death of a child in this bombing. Buildings can be rebuilt, but no power in the world can lift, the almost weightless eyelashes that have closed over the eyes of dead children. So in the middle of all this, we follow the story of Varvara, and as she and Volodya and...
Sorry, I just wanted to say, that was a great passage, but also, even before that, the way he describes the buildings being knocked over, saying that they began to die just as people die. And obviously it's not as sad as a child dying, but just, I thought the way that he described the buildings falling down was so vivid.
Oh yeah, it was.
These were some quite interesting passages.
So we follow the story of Varvara and Volodya. Keep in mind that Varvara is married to Pavel Andreev, who is the kind of model factory worker. They are being evacuated alongside the people from the orphanage. This is the same orphanage that Marussia was previously auditing. So we've got the director of the orphanage, Tokareva, and as well as many of the other people working there. And we follow the story through this as of Varvara and her grandson trying to find Natalia, and the way that these refugees who went to Varvara had looked on almost like, you're coming in our city, you're taking our food, and she realized that very quickly all of them have her same story. They're leaving behind their life, their hopes and dreams, everything they spent so long building. She talks to one man who says, on the journey, before the war, his son had died, and while this is the third time he's being evacuated. The second time his wife died, and the third time evacuation, his daughter-in-law was killed. So it's just him, an old man, and his two granddaughters, and she finds the two granddaughters grasp onto his coat and look up at him as if he's some sort of hero, even though he's a frail old man. So we follow the story of many of these refugees, and from there we go to this tale of a very long tale of a truck driver who is supposed to get them some supplies, but spends all day kind of dicking around, essentially, before dropping stuff off. And as he leaves, he becomes, notably, I think, the first specific death of the book. As he continued up the slope, he could hear the engine struggling. Then he heard the howl of a falling bomb. He pressed his head to the steering wheel, sensed with all his body the end of his life, thought with awful anguish, "Fuck that," and ceased to exist. I've read much more graphic and brutal death scenes in books, but I think there's just something so singularly terrible about only having a moment to think, having awful anguish and think, "Fuck," and then you're gone. Mm-hmm. That's all I have to say about that.
Yeah, that's about all there is.
So we follow more interactions between the people in the boat, really quite touching ones. It's very sweet, all things considered, that they're being evacuated. And, you know this book, this isn't going to go well, but it's, we follow the stories of many of the children we learned about when Marussia had audited the orphanage. And at this point, Marussia has joined them as well. Marussia and Natalia, who is Varvara's daughter-in-law, they're just going to go to a certain point before Marussia comes back. And the children some of them are freaking out. They begin to comfort each other. The one mute boy who is Ukrainian, who saw both of his parents killed, finally he begins to speak and express that he's afraid, and he's convinced to cry over his fear. And another of the boys, Slava, kind of just like takes the kid's hand and tells him, like, "No, I'm here, right here with you," and like basically tries, even though they're the same age and both fearing over their loss and having both lost parents, says, I'll protect you, I'll be your friend. And they set off into launch, and there are many touching moments. And of course, the boat stops working right as overhead German planes begin to fly and drop bombs all around them. And in that moment, in panic, to get the children off the boat, those sailors load most of the orphanage on there. Marussia gets on there. Varvara and Volodya try to get on, but there's not enough space for them. They push off, and right as they push off, the boat begins to work again. And a cheer goes up, and they begin to say, we'll meet the dinghy on the far side. And as the people on the boat finish their cheer, they look out and realize that the dinghy is now flipped over and sinking rapidly, and it disappears. From there, we follow the stories of the individual members of the Shaposhnikov family as the bombing commences. Alexandra and Sophia are at Alexandra's apartment. They flee very quickly. They have moments of argument while they're going, and Sophia kind of saying, "Oh, you need to grab this and this," and Alexandra saying, "We don't. It's not worth it." They go outside and realize that, against all odds, their building is mostly untouched, at least by direct hits. Well, many buildings around them have been reduced to rubble. They go to a bomb shelter, and we learn more about the interactions of people, both good and bad, there. And Sophia kind of says, after sitting there a while, it's like, well, they're going to need doctors. They need to go to the hospital. And so Alexandra gives her a brooch and, a kiss. And as they're going, a woman makes an anti-Semitic comment about Sophia. And as Alexandra is looking at Sophia leave, she knew, Grossman writes, with startling clarity, that she would never see her again. Zhenya, at the same time, as the city's being bombed, she's just in a state of shock. She's just wandering around. Everyone around her thinks she's a mad woman, and it's noted that, what she sees in later days, it's noted that everything she says she saw, it wasn't all at once, it was over the course of days, so she really couldn't tell, as the scene you're seeing itself is her same recollection, which is frazzled and inconsistent, and she just is basically watching the city, watching people's lives, and everyone, is like, get down, but she just keeps wandering, and get this line as she watches a mother dying while their son holds her. "Human suffering, will it be remembered in centuries to come? The stones of huge buildings endure and the glory of generals endures, but human suffering does not. Tears and whispers, a cry of pain and despair, the last sigh and groan of the dying, all this disappears along with the smoke and dust blown across the steppe by the wind." She comes to a bomb shelter and finds her mother Alexandra, and there, from there we continue into Vera's story, and she's blown across the room by a bomb, and like is running out, and is like her first thought is that she needs to go to her family. And as she runs out into the street, there's just something about that, something forced that she can't even say. And the narrator says, who knows really what force it was that made her turn around and look back at the hospital and immediately march back in and just get right to work of getting people, evacuating patients from upper floors. In fact, even floors that other people have abandoned because it's too dangerous. She begins going up and, by herself pulling patients down the corridor. And we go on an extended section of, this theme has come up time and time again of the people showing their real character. And it's noted that many people there were maybe drunkards or suspected of stealing, and Vera herself was, known for being late or even ignoring patients. But in this moment, no one was surprised that she had stayed. And there are people who seem better and, might have expected to. And in fact, in the moment that they disappeared, people were actually not surprised that they were no longer there. We continue on from there to Andreev, or Vera actually is eventually, she's so injured that she's made to go lie out in the lawn. We follow Andreev, he's standing in the factory floor, and he's wondering what happened to Varvara, and he realizes that he really misses her, and he doesn't know what to do, because she is his life, and he also is the factory, and he's looking at it as it's still working under the bombing, and wonders, what will happen, what will happen in the future, and maybe it was all for nothing. And from here we go to a broader perspective of Richtofen getting in a plane and going to see all the destruction and being pleased, and a condemnation of people who see destruction and think that this is some sort of advancement. And I kind of want to end on two last, I've been reading a lot of lines today, this episode's gone long, but I want to end on two last things that the narrator ends on. As always, when some catastrophe tests people to the utmost, many of the inhabitants of Stalingrad behaved in unexpected ways. It has often been said that during a natural disaster, people cease to act like human beings, that they become puppets driven by some blind instinct of self-preservation. And there were indeed people in Stalingrad who pilfered what had been entrusted to them, who looted vodka shops and food depots. There was pushing and shoving and sometimes fighting as people tried to board ferries. There were some whose duty was to remain in Stalingrad but who chose to cross to the East Bank. There were others who liked to make out that they were born warriors but who on this day showed only the most pitiful weakness. Such observations are often made in a sad whisper, as if they constitute some unpalatable but inescapable final truth. In reality, however, they are only part of the truth. Amid the smoke and thunder of exploding bombs, steelworkers at Red October remained by their open hearth furnaces. The main tractor factory workshops, the hot shop, and the assembly and repair shops worked on without a minute's break. At Stahlgräs, the engineer in charge of the boiler did not leave his post even when he was showered from head to foot with shattered brick and glass, and a splinter from a heavy bomb took out half of the control lever. There were more than a few policemen, firemen, soldiers, and militiamen who died trying to extinguish fires that could not be extinguished. There are many accounts of the wonderful courage of children, of the calm, clear wisdom shown by elderly workers. At times like this, misconceptions are exposed for what they are. The burning streets of Stalingrad were a testing ground for a true measure of man. And as Richtofen is flying above the city, he believes he's seeing its final death throes. But in fact, the narrator says, this is not so. A great city was perishing, but this did not mean that Russia was being enslaved. Still less that she was dying. Amid the smoke and ashes, the Soviets' people's strength, love, and belief in freedom was still obstinately alive, even growing stronger. And this indestructible force was already beginning to triumph over the futile violence of those trying to enslave it. So this is a whirlwind of kind of denouement to the lead of literally 550 pages of getting to the actual invasion of Stalingrad.
Yeah. What the heck?
Yeah.
I think that I guess just not having read this or knowing like anything about this, except that it would be about Stalingrad in some way. First of all, much better than I thought, even though I had not a ton of expectation, has far exceeded anything I could have imagined. But also, it's really not a book about the war at all. It's a book about stuff, and there's also war happening.
Yeah.
Right? Book about life, really, as I've jokingly said, but it's true.
Yeah, no, that's very true. And then the war comes, and it makes itself known. It's not a war of some eras where the war is like in the background of, noble families who are thinking about it. It's the war which is affecting everyone in it, and
yeah.
The individual lives to, I was enraptured by each of the scenes of, each of the family members and their disparate stories and the ways they reacted and the varieties of every human interaction that they saw at this time, or of course, the sadness of the fact that tens of thousands of people were dying at this moment, and that, these families are not protective of that. In the moment we follow the deaths of some of the family members who've been with for, well, I guess I'll say probable deaths of the family members who've been with for 500 pages. That just happens in that moment.
Yeah, I was rereading it. It was ambiguous.
Yeah.
I thought it read as if the bomb hit the boat, and then when they saw it reappear, that was like everyone was dead. But it could be read as if there was so much water around where the bomb had hit that it flipped them, and it is possible that they survived. Though I feel like if Grossman does that, it is only to kill them off at a later date. I'm still skeptical he's leaving everyone alive. I don't see it.
Yeah, and more so because this scene is, I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but this is pulled one-to-one from a story that Grossman himself heard of this exact event happening, where the evacuation barge takes off, stops working, people get in the dinghy, the barge starts working, but as the dinghy has already gone far ahead, they have to watch helplessly as all the children, old people they loaded into are I think actually were gunned down by German planes.
Worse.
So, yeah.
So to move us away from talking about children being gunned down by planes,
Yes, that's fair.
I have only a few remaining points because we have been talking our way through this, which has been quite wonderful. Thank you for your company. I really like this passage of Zhenya just kind of wandering through the war zone. It is one reminiscent of the scene in War and Peace where Pierre is just kind of wandering around he's intentionally seeking out a battle, and then he gets all turned around and he's like, whoa, this is crazy. It's a little different because Zhenya did not ask for her city to be bombed, but there's a similar sense of disorientation in war that is totally takes you out of what is happening and your ability to process anything. But two, I don't know if this was just me or I don't know if this was just me or if anyone else notices this. There are a handful of words in Russian literature that when I see or hear, I immediately link to something else. And one of them is ship. So this passage where Zhenya, and I see this is where I think I'm right. There's a lot of textual evidence for this. And it's a thing nobody cares at all if I'm right about, but I'm going to go off on it anyways. So this passage,
Go for it.
and Zhenya with her artist's eye, which could be satirical at this point, I don't even know. With her artist's eye, her ability to see inner unexpected similarities, suddenly she saw the building as a huge 5-story ship emerging from a misty, smoke-filled harbor into a raging sea. So, one, I think this is hilarious because we've spent all this time talking about how she's not really actually a good artist, and it is not insightful, but I guess to each their own. This is, I think, being told from her perspective here. So, but it made me think of Lermontov and his poem The Sail, which is like if you were to read any Russian poem, like this is probably one of the only ones you'd have ever read, right? Everyone's read that one. It's about a ship in a storm, and that's basically it. And it just made me think about that, and on how deep of a literary level I really think Grossman is trying to engage in, because that means that we've had Tolstoy most clearly. I think we definitely had Dostoevsky here. We've definitely had Turgenev, and we have Lermontov. And so it's just interesting the way that he uses these kind of, these same ideas, same thoughts, and is trying to like mesh them into this 20th century framework is very interesting.
Right, yeah.
That's all I had on that.
No, it feels like, I think that's a good point. I think we talked a lot about Grossman almost writing like a, jokingly, I guess we've been calling it true socialist realism, where, the people aren't superhumans, but they're ordinary, which, also allows them to be ordinary-heroic. And I think in some ways, this book almost reads more as just like a work of pure, I guess, pure realism to me. I mean,
yeah.
it's telling you about the underside, of all the people, of the difficulties of people's failings, of systematic thefts, of robbing of like refugees and all this other stuff. It's not a rosy view, definitely, of what it was like to be in the Soviet Union during the war, at least in the in the Russian Republic of it. It does have an ideological component, absolutely, but in many ways it feels like a holdover of an older era of writing, especially with the presence of like Imperial Russian era authors so heavily in its analysis and in the ways it looks at the world.
See, that's why I'm just not really completely convinced that socialist realism can be defined as a genre, or that there's any real distinguishing aspect of it as a genre. Maybe more as a process, but I don't know if I'm convinced it's a genre still.
Yeah.
I'd love to be, but I'm not sure I am. We'll
have to come back to it one day. We'll
I know. I bring it up
proper
every time.
head piece on socialist realism.
Yeah, I get so angry every time I get myself thinking about it. I'm the only one who lays awake at night like, is it a genre? But I do that. Okay, so my other thing is time.
Yes,
I'm a big guy for time. No, I love
big on time.
Big on time. That's me.
I hear that from you all the time.
So the quickness and intensity of flashbacks now is starting to change that we're in war. Well, I guess the narrative is in war. I'm not at war, thankfully. A lot of the narrative is structured around these like very old flashbacks, right? Like Krimov, for instance, like you'll have him present day, and then you'll get flashback to him like Revolutionary War era, and there's other instances of this, but this is hard because I read 2 chapters ahead, and this would make my point better, but I'll not do it. Just know when you start reading ahead, you're gonna be like, wow, that was a good point. I bet that works here too, and it does. Which is that Grossman starts to compress the time in which the sort of shifting of time is taking place. It's no longer decades at a time. It's like days, or it starts to become like hours. And it's not necessarily about how someone's personality has changed. Now it's like, oh yeah, they're dead. Look at this, like the someone with an Ava, the first one that died.
It's the truck driver who is probably the one who Clava was sleeping with.
Right. Sorry, there's a lot of Avas.
There are a lot of Avas.
My brain at this hour. But yeah, the truck driver, right? The fact that you get that flashback and it fills you in, but then it immediately dies. I just think that's an interesting thing that starts to happen. And obviously it starts to happen with soldiers kind of later, now that you actually have, I mean, like we've had military combat, but it's mostly been retreat-ish stuff. And now it's, we're going to be on less of that, I think.
Yeah.
If I had to guess. But, I'll tell you what, Cameron, boy, I sure hope they win.
I haven't gotten to the end of the book yet, so don't spoil it for me to see.
Please, no spoilers.
I've actually, thankfully, every time I talk about World War II, I've been having someone bludgeon me over the head. So anytime I access memories related to knowing anything after 1943, I'm hoping now that brain damage will extend mostly to those memories since I was accessing it at the time. And maybe we can really make this a surprise.
Yeah, if you're lucky, maybe it'll just extend to all memories.
Yeah, well, weirdly, I still remember a lot of World War II stuff. I've been losing a lot of my short-term memory, so I can't go about day to day so much, but I think I'll get there eventually.
What year is it? It is 1943, right?
Yeah, after we finish this episode, you're going to get down to the bomb shelter just in case, the Air Force flying above.
Yeah.
Well, Matt, I got to ask you, I know there's a lot of this stuff in the script, which is now a little bit redundant because it's been answered by things you said earlier. But first of all, on a scale of 1 to Yeltsin, and this is a sober Solzhenitsyn, but how drunk are you?
Cameron, I'm wasted on literature. I'll tell you that much. I can't be on that scale since I wasn't drinking.
Sure.
How about the mighty mucus scale? I'm about a 5.
Yeah.
I'm a little congested.
5.
Not terrible. Okay. If you think I sound bad today, you should have heard me yesterday. And if you thought it sounded bad yesterday, you should have heard me the day before. So we're doing pretty good on that scale. How about you? What scale are you working on tonight?
Also being on the sober Solzhenitsyn, although not having any mucus, I'm trying to find another metric I can use.
No muck for you?
I mean, I'm at a 0, and I will be at a 0 until all my books are packed and everything. Also all my other things too. I have other important things besides books.
I need nothing but my books. I was cursing myself when I was doing my move, just like the amount of books that I own. Whew.
Every time I move, since I turned 18, I've moved 5 or 6 times. Mm-hmm. And every time I move, I bring fewer and fewer books. My first time I brought my entire collection in high school, I amassed, and I used to do accounting of all my books because I apparently had too much free time. I had 550 something books, and I brought all of them.
Accounting.
I brought them all to my first apartment for college, and that was a horrible mistake.
Yeah,
so every
time I did about the same thing.
I think now I probably have like a good 30 to 40 books. So I've gone from 500 something to 40 books at a time. And so I'm hoping I won't ever have to move 500 books again.
My God. Terrifying.
And I know everyone knows what we're moving on to, but next episode, which part of Stalingrad are we covering?
Part 7, which is
part 7?
Not confusing at all in that we'll be finishing part 2 of the book.
Mm-hmm.
Which is exciting.
Yes. Which is very exciting.
Which, like, we're finally nearing the point where, like, I think it's something psychological with me, which is, like, when I'm more than halfway through, it feels like I read faster because I'm flipping downhill now.
Yeah.
We finally got to that point.
Reading downhill.
I'm flipping them downhill, yeah. Yeah.
Well, I love this concept.
Yeah. You're welcome. Reminder that you can always email us, tipsytolstoy@gmail.com, if you want us to read your comment on the podcast, preferably about something that we're covering, and not, as my current inbox says from this Russian spammer, would I like to buy aluminum oxide? No, I wouldn't. Send me something different. Yeah, we got an email about that.
Is that spam? Is that a scam? Or is that someone actually trying to sell us oxfood? Whenever people send me spam emails,
I'm not clicking that link. I am not going to click on that.
No, you need to click that link for science.
No. No. What else we got? Somebody wants to join our affiliate program, which we do not have.
Cool. Anything else? Any other good ones?
Another one.
Oh, you have
another one.
What? Another.
I'm not jealous. Can I find here? Serious man? ? Smiley face.
We've gotten so many of those. It feels like at this point, the more I listen to him, the less it was never flirty in the first place, but it feels. Did you ever read that book, or I think it was made into a horrible movie, The Snowman by Joe Nesbo? I don't remember if this is a feature of the book or a movie.
Is it about a serious snowman?
No, the killer, the serial killer in the book, like always leaves behind a snowman with like a little note in it. Like, this is like the famous, I don't think this is in the book, but like the famous one from the movie trailer was, you could have saved her, Mr. Policeman. I gave you all the clues. This is the vibe that this line is giving me. Like, it's where later on we're going to realize that, a serious man was some kind of clue for us that we should be tracking something down to like save, like little Timmy from drowning, who's like stuck in like a drainage pipe under, we just have to find the key to unlock the thing to let him out before the serial killer gets away with it again.
Uh-huh.
Is this just, you getting that vibe at all? Is that just me?
I don't know. I think you're taking it too seriously because you have a very good prime candidate here.
I am the serious
But she specifies, I'm real girl and looking for a serious and hot relationship. So if that matches anyone's profile out there, let us know. We will connect you.
You're but looking for a real girl, looking for serious
Cameron,
and hot.
Stop messing around. You have to be a serious man here.
Real girl needs serious man.
We did get a serious question, actually, as I was going through the inbox that I ignored. I didn't ignore. The problem is the website spits this into the same filter I have as just like website updates. And so I get 1,000 things about like, your plugins have been updated, and I'm like, leave me alone. This is actually from one of our patrons, Blake. Hello, Blake. Email captioned, titled Stalingrad Part 3 Questions. Hey guys, I'm loving the recent pods on Stalingrad. Thank you. I read the book earlier this year, and your context analysis has made a lot of connections that I didn't make myself. I've especially enjoyed the deep dive into Grossman himself. I didn't realize, for example, just how much Victor is modeled on his own life. My questions are, who was the other candidate for the Soviet Tolstoy? Is it consensus now that Grossman won out that distinction?
Oh, I don't remember who that was off the top of my head. I do have that information written down somewhere.
Cameron's going to splice that in later. It's going to be magic.
I'm going to splice that. Yeah.
I will just say that the idea of a Soviet Tolstoy was not necessarily like an honor to be bestowed upon people. It was more of like a philosophical idea, I think, initially, at least during the period that I studied, or that I initially was kind of focusing on. I don't know if I've gone on this rant, but I will here because I've got a couple minutes.
Go for it.
In the 1920s, this writer that I studied, Sergei Tretyakov, he wrote this article called The New Leo Tolstoy in this radical journal called The Left Front of the Arts that he worked on with like Mayakovsky and a bunch of other, just like basically like everyone who's like one of the boys and gals were writing for this journal. And he was basically saying that we don't need Leo Tolstoy, like that you shouldn't be trying to model your process of literary production on the same things that were popular in pre-revolutionary Russia, essentially saying that the new material conditions were going to dictate a new kind of art that we haven't even begun to conceive of yet. And he kind of got into his big idea was called factography. And he was really a kind of forerunner, like he was kind of in the forefront of what would become kind of the way Soviet newspaper develops, and in a less fun way, like the way like Soviet internal security develops. This idea that you can be everywhere all the time, like always is a really big component of how he thought news should kind of work. And so that's a long way of saying that not everybody wanted a Soviet Tolstoy. This is something that comes about, I think, really with the Writers' Union, with the kind of advent of that. But for a really long time, this was not necessarily something that people wanted, or at least that the radical socialists really wanted. And is it a consensus now that Grossman won out that distinction? Probably. I don't think it's not an official distinction. I just think in general, that's something that he's often known as. And I think you're going to splice it a little bit later, right, Cameron? I remember reading that part as well about the battle of the Soviet Tolstoys. It was just like, in the Writers' Union became so incredibly political and tense. And so it wasn't always the people that had the best literary talent that were promoted from within, of course.
Yes, and I will say, I will splice in the exact name of the person, the other kind of like the other faction, who it is. I will say, whoever it is not someone you've ever heard of, and not anyone who doesn't specifically study this has heard of at this point in history.
There you go. There's your answer.
It was not anyone of any note. I mean, I shouldn't say that. Someone who, in certain contexts, definitely had note. However, broadly speaking.
Yeah. But these are interesting questions to ask, especially when you think about socialist realism. Is it a genre? Let's find out.
Yeah.
I think it's really bound up with the Writers' Union and kind of centralizing that production. It, well, obviously is, but even the idea of it was not something that was popular in the 20s. Or it wasn't even a thing in the 20s, so the idea of socialist realism.
Yeah.
There were a lot of other terms that were being thrown around and used until this is kind of consolidated in the 30s. 34 to be exact. Anyways, these are things that I know that haunt me.